The moment I stepped off the plane, the familiar hum of my hometown hit me like a memory I had tucked away, both comforting and unsettling. Years abroad had changed me, sharpened my ambitions, and widened my perspective, but the streets, the cafes, the old park where we used to play, it all felt frozen in time. Like I had slipped into a photograph of my past. I had imagined this return countless times, picturing warm embraces, laughter, and stories shared over coffee with family I had missed more than I could admit. Instead, the first face I saw was my cousin's, standing by the door, perfectly poised, a practiced smile on their lips. It was a smile meant to be polite, but I could feel the subtle frost behind it, the judgment that lingered like a shadow over their eyes. They had changed, and yet they hadn't. They were surrounded by friends who laughed too loudly and carried themselves as if every room was theirs by right. Their wardrobe spoke of success, elegance, and a life curated for admiration, while I, carrying only a suitcase and the weight of my years away, felt conspicuously simple, almost invisible. Conversations were clipped and polite, but I could sense the glances, the unspoken whispers, the silent comparisons to the person I had been and the one I had become. Even as I tried to greet them warmly, I felt the prick of being measured and found wanting, like my achievements abroad were invisible in the shadow of their carefully constructed image. Each laugh that rang out from their circle seemed to emphasize what they thought of me: distant, outdated, irrelevant. I realized then that my return was not just a homecoming, it was a test, an unwelcome intrusion into a world where I was expected to remain small. My chest tightened with a mix of resentment and longing. I wanted to speak, to assert myself, to show that time had shaped me into someone resilient, yet the words caught in my throat. Instead, I followed them into the house, nodded at relatives who gave polite smiles, and felt the gulf widen between what they assumed about me and the life I had quietly built. My heart ached, not just from the sting of judgment, but from the nostalgia for a bond that seemed irreparably altered, leaving me caught between the comfort of familiarity and the sting of alienation. The evening stretched ahead, and I understood that this reunion would be more than a simple gathering. It was the opening act of a story where old ties would be tested, and the scales of perception were about to be recalibrated. A few days after my arrival, my cousin called me, their voice dripping with a practiced warmth that barely concealed something sharper beneath. "We're having a little family gathering at the Penthouse," they said. "I thought you might like to see how much has changed since you've been gone." There was an edge in the way they phrased it, as if they were measuring how I would react, testing me before the real event even began. I could hear the unspoken implication. They had made it, and now they were showing off everything I had been missing while I was working and living abroad. My stomach tightened, a cocktail of irritation and anticipation stirring within me. Every family member I ran into afterward offered comments like, "You'll see, the Penthouse is amazing now," or whispered about my simple life. Each word hit like a small reminder of how conspicuously ordinary I appeared next to their polished image. I could feel my pride bristle, yet I stayed silent. I didn't want to show any hint of discomfort or awe, because deep down, I knew something they didn't. Something that would shift the balance in a way no mocking comment could undo. Accepting the invitation felt like stepping into a trap. Yet I also sensed it was the perfect stage for what I had quietly prepared over the years. When I arrived that evening, dressed modestly but elegantly, I could already feel the subtle shifts of power in the air. The casual hellos, the measured smiles, and the tiny glances that accompanied my entry were all part of the performance my cousin orchestrated, thinking themselves in control. I nodded politely, masking the awareness that I held the key to the penthouse in my back pocket, metaphorically speaking, and maybe literally, depending on how things unfolded. As I followed them upstairs, the city lights glimmering through the expansive windows, I reminded myself to stay calm, composed, and patient. The night would reveal much, but the advantage had already quietly shifted. Stepping into the penthouse, I felt a wave of disorientation. The city lights spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow over marble floors so polished they reflected the chandelier, like it belonged in a palace rather than a family apartment. Every surface screamed wealth, designer furniture arranged with meticulous precision. artwork that looked expensive enough to make my stomach twist, and an air of curated perfection that seemed almost suffocating. My cousin floated through the space, narrating each detail as if we were tourists in someone else's life. "Finally, we're living the high life," they said with a grin that was equal parts pride and challenge, their voice laced with superiority I could almost taste. Each comment was a subtle jab, a reminder that I was the outsider, the one who had lived abroad but apparently hadn't made it the way they had. I smiled tightly, nodding at their words while my mind catalogued every flash of arrogance. Relatives hovered nearby, polite but judgmental, their eyes darting to my modest outfit, my unassuming bag, the quiet way I carried myself. I could sense the pity that hung like wallpaper behind their smiles. It made my chest ache, a mix of frustration, sadness, and a simmering determination that refused to be crushed. I wanted to tell them all that appearances were deceiving, that wealth was not the only measure of success, but I stayed silent, letting the silence itself be a quiet rebuke. Each step I took across the marble felt deliberate, a reminder that I had agency even in a room designed to make me feel small. I noticed my cousin's friends whispering, their laughter slightly too loud, as if to emphasize my place in the hierarchy. I reminded myself that patience was a weapon, that humility could mask power, and that their ostentatious display would soon be irrelevant in the face of the truth I carried quietly. The evening stretched ahead, like a stage set for confrontation. Yet I held my composure, feeling the tension coil within me like a spring. This was the moment where the facade of superiority met quiet awareness, where every glance and whispered judgment would become part of the story they would never see coming. Dinner began with the clink of cutlery and the polite murmur of conversation, but it didn't take long for the subtle cruelty to emerge. My cousin, emboldened by the presence of friends and relatives, leaned back in their chair with that self-satisfied grin and began. "Still carrying that old handbag? I see some things never change," they said, voice loud enough to echo through the high-ceilinged room. Laughter rippled around the table, awkward at first, then more genuine as if everyone needed to prove they were on the right side of superiority. I felt my fingers tighten around the strap of my bag under the table, keeping my composure as I measured my response. "And these clothes," they continued, eyes flicking over my outfit with exaggerated scrutiny. "Still living in your old apartment days, I see. Must be hard adjusting back to simplicity." The word stung, but I refused to let my expression betray anything. Around the table, I caught relatives exchanging glances, unsure whether to laugh or avert their eyes. Some smiles were polite, others tinged with pity, but none truly understanding that their perception was about to crumble. Inside my bag lay the documents that could turn the evening upside down. Ownership papers, legal proof of what my cousin was flaunting without realizing it was mine. I imagined the look on their face when the reality hit, and it made my chest swell with a quiet, controlled triumph. For now, I let the mockery wash over me, each word sharpening my resolve rather than breaking it. I stayed present, letting them speak, watching their confidence inflate with each joke, unaware that their high-handedness was planting the seeds of their own humiliation. While their laughter filled the room, I felt a calm, patient power settling over me, like a silent tide rising against an oblivious shore. This was not humiliation. It was preparation. Each jab, each whispered chuckle, each pointed remark would become part of the narrative they never saw coming. And I smiled inwardly, savoring the tension that quietly grew around me. As my cousin's laughter echoed through the penthouse, my mind drifted back to years before, to the small apartment where I first met Mrs. Whitaker. She was frail, stubborn, and endlessly sharp, a woman who had built her empire from scratch but now needed someone she could trust. I had been her nurse, visiting daily, managing medications, and keeping her company when her children had drifted away. Over time, our conversations had turned from mundane check-ins to heartfelt stories of life, loss, and ambition. She confided in me in ways she hadn't with anyone else, sharing secrets about properties, investments, and her fears of being forgotten. I listened, offered advice, and never once imagined the depth of gratitude she would feel for my loyalty. When her health declined, she insisted on meeting me privately, her eyes misty, but determined. "I want you to have what I built," she said, pressing a folder of documents into my hands. Within were deeds, contracts, and legal papers, her entire property portfolio, including the very penthouse where my cousin now hosted their gathering. "Keep it safe and don't let anyone know until the time is right," she whispered. I nodded, overwhelmed but aware of the responsibility. Over the years, I had honored her trust, keeping the secret close, choosing patience over pride, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Tonight, as my cousin flaunted their wealth, oblivious that the penthouse belonged to me, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a long-kept secret ready to shift the scales. This inheritance wasn't just property. It was proof that life had its ways of rewarding patience, loyalty, and discretion, even when others assumed superiority. Holding the documents close in my bag now, I knew the moment of reckoning was approaching, a moment that would rewrite the hierarchy in a single, unforgettable evening. The words hit me like a slap I didn't see coming. My cousin, grinning like a victor, leaned forward and sneered. "Honestly, I don't know how your mother managed to raise someone so ordinary. Must have been exhausting for her." The table went silent for a heartbeat, the air thick with discomfort and disbelief. I felt my stomach twist, a surge of rage mingling with a deep, familiar ache. My mother had given everything she could for me, teaching me resilience, compassion, and dignity. And here was my cousin turning her legacy into a weapon against me. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to contain the heat rising in my chest, the flush creeping across my neck. My breathing became sharp, ragged, as if I were fighting to hold back the words that wanted to erupt. Polite laughter had stopped. Relatives were shifting uncomfortably, sensing the tension but not intervening. I stood abruptly, murmuring something about getting some fresh air, and excused myself. The balcony door felt heavy in my hand, but the city skyline greeted me like a breath of freedom. Lights shimmered across glass towers, streets pulsing with life, and I leaned against the railing, letting the wind whip against my face. In that moment, the contrast was unbearable. I was calm, poised, yet burning inside, while inside my cousin reveled in their imagined superiority. I closed my eyes, thinking of all the years of quiet diligence, of nights spent building a life they believed I had squandered. Rage and sorrow intertwined, but beneath it all, a steely resolve began to form. I realized I no longer needed to play small or invisible. The documents in my bag, the inheritance I had protected, the patience I had honed, they were my arsenal. Tonight I would stop being the silent observer. Tonight, the truth would surface, and the balance of power would shift irreversibly. I inhaled the crisp night air, feeling it fortify my spine, and for the first time that evening, I smiled, knowing the reckoning was imminent. The next morning, I picked up my phone with deliberate calm, dialing the property manager who oversaw the penthouse. My voice was polite, casual, as I confirmed tomorrow's inspection meeting, casually mentioning a few details about upcoming renovations and legal formalities. I could hear my cousin in the background, laughing at something trivial, oblivious to the call. Then I noticed a shift. They had paused mid-sentence, their laughter faltering, ears straining toward my words. I spoke of minor maintenance issues, scheduling conflicts, and ownership confirmations, careful not to reveal too much, but enough to seed doubt. I could sense their confusion, the flicker of suspicion behind their once confident gaze. A faint crease appeared between their brows, their body language subtly changing, the smugness that had dominated the room weakening with each phrase I let slip. They leaned closer to the phone, trying to catch every detail, unaware that I was fully aware of their eavesdropping. Every polite, mundane word I spoke became a puzzle piece they couldn't yet place, and the arrogance that had fueled their earlier mockery started to crack. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a thrill in the power of patience, knowing that the first hints of revelation had been planted. By the time I hung up, I could see the transformation begin. Curiosity, doubt, and a flicker of fear replacing the confidence that had defined my cousin's demeanor. The shift had begun, subtle but undeniable, and I let myself savor the anticipation, knowing the balance was slowly tipping in my favor. I arrived at the penthouse just after 9, the morning sunlight glinting off the glass facade as if signaling the start of something monumental. In my company were a lawyer and the property officer, both professional and composed, understanding the delicacy of what was about to unfold. As we entered, my cousin's family was already gathered, chatting idly, their laughter still carrying the echoes of last night's mockery. The room shifted as we stepped inside, the chatter faltering as their eyes fell on me. I kept my expression calm, measured, but inside, my pulse thrummed with quiet exhilaration. The property officer stepped forward first, clearing their throat politely. "Good morning, everyone. I'm here to conduct the scheduled inspection with Ms. My last name, the owner of this property." The words landed like a hammer striking glass. Silence spread immediately, thick and heavy, as if the air itself was shocked into stillness. My cousin froze mid-step, their smug smile evaporating as confusion and disbelief warred across their features. Their friends stammered, glances exchanged like panic signals, while relatives whispered behind cupped hands, eyes widening as comprehension dawned slowly. I remained composed, letting the pause stretch, letting the reality sink in. I could feel the power shifting, an invisible tide pulling the room in my direction, and it was intoxicating. My cousin tried to speak, to assert something, but no words came out. Their authority, carefully constructed over the years, crumbled in an instant. The lawyer placed a folder of documents on the marble table, open and precise, showing deeds, legal confirmations, and signatures that confirmed my ownership beyond dispute. Gasps punctuated the silence, each one a nail in the coffin of my cousin's arrogance. I walked calmly through the room, nodding politely at stunned relatives and friends, my presence filling the space with quiet dominance. The room had transformed. It was no longer their stage. It was mine. Eyes that had once judged me now flicked with awe, confusion, and a hint of fear. My cousin's lips parted and closed, searching for a rebuttal, but the facts were undeniable, and their laughter, their casual superiority, had vanished like smoke. In that suspended moment, I realized how powerful patience and discretion could be, how a single well-timed revelation could upend years of assumed hierarchy. The penthouse, once a symbol of their ostentatious pride, had become the stage for their unraveling, and I stood at the center, composed, triumphant, and ready for the next act. My cousin's face twisted, a mixture of disbelief and fury flashing across features that had been so carefully sculpted for superiority. This isn't possible," they stammered, eyes darting between me, the lawyer, and the property officer, as if a sudden illness had left them unsteady. "You're lying. You can't own this place." The voice, usually so confident and cutting, trembled under the weight of the undeniable truth. I remained still, my breathing steady, letting the room absorb the tension, knowing that any hint of anger from me would only diminish the impact. The lawyer, calm and precise, opened the folder again, sliding the documents across the polished marble table. The deeds, legal signatures, and official stamps glinted under the morning light, each one a nail sealing the coffin of my cousin's arrogance. A hush fell over the room. Relatives who had whispered about my modest lifestyle and simple choices now looked at me with stunned silence, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, unsure how to process the reversal they were witnessing. My cousin's hands shook as they reached for the papers, their voice quivering. Why? They could barely form words, the certainty of their superiority evaporating into panic and confusion. I felt a rush of vindication, a warmth of quiet triumph spreading through me as the weight of years of mockery and dismissal lifted, replaced by a profound sense of empowerment. Friends and relatives who had once chuckled at my supposed ordinariness now avoided my gaze, unsure whether to apologize, scold, or simply retreat into silence. I let them stew in their own astonishment, savoring the poetic justice that had unfolded with surgical precision. Every smirk that had been aimed at me, every subtle jab about my life, every comment about my invisible achievements had culminated in this moment, a moment where patience, discretion, and quiet resolve proved infinitely more powerful than arrogance. I kept my expression calm, almost serene, as if this outcome had always been inevitable, letting the contrast between my composure and their unraveling speak louder than any words could. The room had changed. The hierarchy had been rewritten, and for the first time that evening, The air felt charged with my silent authority. Their disbelief, their stunned looks, and the tremor in my cousin's voice were the clearest confirmation that the scales had finally tipped in my favor. As the initial shock settled over the room, the property officer leaned closer, whispering that legally I could request they leave immediately. My cousin's face had gone pale, a mixture of panic and desperation painting every line. Their friends hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene or disappear entirely. I felt the familiar surge of triumph, the sweet satisfaction of justice delivered, but beneath it all, a calmer, steadier thought took hold. Power wasn't just in victory, it was in how you wielded it. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of my decision before speaking. I won't force you out tonight, I said softly, locking eyes with my cousin. You'll have 1 month to make arrangements. I expect the space returned in good order, but you'll leave with dignity. The words hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. Relief mixed with disbelief flickered across the faces of relatives, but most of all, my cousin froze, realizing the tables had shifted entirely. Their arrogance had crumbled, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that I controlled the narrative now, not through spite, but through restraint. The act of granting them time, a semblance of respect, magnified the reversal, turning their humiliation into a lesson wrapped in grace. I watched as their pride faltered, eyes wide and voice faint, while I remained composed, embodying a quiet authority that no argument could undermine. In that moment, the balance of power wasn't just legal, it was emotional. I had taken the reins of the situation, showing that true strength was measured not only by what you could take, but by what you chose to give. As I stepped back, letting the room breathe, I felt the shift complete. The penthouse, once a stage for my cousin's superiority, now reflected a new hierarchy, one built on patience, intelligence, and merciful strategy. The lesson was clear. Triumph is sweetest when tempered with humanity, and those who underestimate you learn far more than they expect. By the next morning, the penthouse was quiet, but the ripple of last night's revelation had already spread beyond its walls. Relatives called or messaged, some hesitant, some eager, sharing snippets of the story with neighbors and friends. I began hearing whispers of astonishment. Can you believe she owns it all? Or I never imagined she'd turn out like this. Truly inspiring. The same people who had once glanced at me with pity now spoke my name with a mixture of awe and respect, their tones acknowledging the strength and patience I had shown. My cousin, once the center of attention, withdrew into themselves, retreating to the corners of gatherings, avoiding eye contact, their earlier arrogance replaced with visible shame. I received a short, trembling text from them that morning. An apology, awkward and hesitant, acknowledging my victory and their misjudgment. I read it carefully, then set my phone aside, leaving it unanswered. Words could not undo the months or years of mockery and underestimation. Instead, I let silence speak, letting the consequences of their arrogance settle fully, allowing the lesson to resonate. Observing from a distance, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience and restraint had done more damage than confrontation ever could. The gossip, the awe, the subtle shift in family dynamics all reinforced that power and respect were not demanded. They were earned, often in ways invisible until the moment of revelation. While my cousin wrestled with regret, I moved forward, aware that their isolation and shame were just the natural fallout of their choices, a reminder that true victory is measured not by immediate triumph, but by the lasting recognition of one's worth. I stepped out onto the balcony once more, the same spot where hours ago I had leaned against the railing, chest tight with anger and grief. Now, the city sprawled beneath me like a sea of lights, serene and indifferent, a reminder of how far I had come, not just in distance, but in life. The memories of last night played through my mind. My cousin's smug laughter, the pointed remarks about my mother, the whispers of relatives who had pitied me. Each cutting word that had once felt like a wound now seemed almost trivial, absorbed into a larger narrative I had patiently written with silence and restraint. I thought about how I had felt powerless then, invisible, and how I had transformed that helplessness into strategy. My hand brushed against the railing, cool metal grounding me, And I realized the true power hadn't been in proving ownership or flaunting wealth. It had been in maintaining my dignity, in letting patience, composure, and timing orchestrate justice without me raising my voice. The wind carried the distant hum of traffic, and I let it wash over me, carrying away lingering resentment and replacing it with clarity. I had conquered not just the room or the penthouse, but the emotional weight I had carried for years, the longing for validation, the fear of being underestimated. Silence had been my weapon, and in it I had found a strange, intoxicating satisfaction. The city shimmered below, indifferent yet majestic, a mirror to the calm I now felt inside. My victory was no longer tangible in papers or property. It was internal, a quiet triumph over past humiliation, a reclaiming of my worth, and an unwavering understanding that true power comes from emotional peace. I exhaled slowly, savoring the stillness, aware that no mockery or arrogance could touch me again. Tonight, I had proven something far more valuable than ownership. I had proven to myself that patience, dignity, and self-respect were the ultimate currency, and they were mine to keep.